We do these operations as a joint force, and it requires all the services, and the Space Force and U.S. Cyber Command are just as involved as the Air Force and the ground forces. I mean, it's truly a real joint, multi-domain operation when we do something like that.
The race for national security dominance in space has become a central aspect of 21st century great power competition, with China, Russia, and others challenging the United States as the world leader in the futuristic warfare domain. I'm Guy Taylor, National Security Editor at the Washington Times, and for this edition of the Threat Status Influencers Series, we're inside the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, and we're lucky to be joined by General B. Chance Saltzman, the Chief of Space Operations for the United States Space Force. His call sign is Salty, and without question, he's among the most seasoned of the U.S. military leaders that work in this building. General Saltzman, thank you for having the Threat Status team here. Let's jump right into this. You had a storied career in the U.S. Air Force, where some even referred to you as the father of multi-domain operations. Then you were tapped in 2022 to lead the newest American service branch, the Space Force. In this unprecedented era in which humanity is increasingly dependent on Earth-orbiting satellites, from where you sit, why is space so important to the U.S. military?
Well, thanks, Guy. Thanks for this opportunity. And first, let's address this, calling me the most seasoned person. That's just code for you're the oldest guy in the building. That I got it. So thank you for that.
We were doing a play on Salt.
I appreciate that. That's good. So it is important to the U.S. military. It's been important to the U.S. military for a long time. I've been doing military space for more than 30 years now. I think the more pressing issue is how important it is to the American public. And I think that might be the thing that's changed the most, at least in the last 10 or 15 years that I've noticed. Americans' daily lives are affected by space capabilities in ways they don't see, in ways they don't even really recognize. I think people know that my phone is connected to a map and the map is guided by GPS, and they kind of generally appreciate that. But the synchronization of signals, the timing synchronization provided by space capabilities really enables the internet. It controls all financial transactions. It really is a force multiplier, if you will, for all of the things that we've come to expect. Amazon deliveries, e-banking. These are things that are enabled by space capabilities. And so it really is a critical part of the American way of life. So it becomes so critical to both the military and the American way of life that our adversaries pay attention. And then they start to try to threaten it. They add some friction. They want to challenge us in these ways, and they see that this might be a way at making things harder on the Americans. And that means we have to protect it. And that's why you get the force.
How do you see the current threat environment in space, particularly with regard to great power rivalry? What kinds of assets do the Russians and the Chinese have in space right now?
I talk about them in categorical terms, and there's really 6 broad categories of weapons that affect space capabilities. And the good thing is there's really only 3 you have to remember, and those 3 can be ground-based or they can be space-based on orbit. And they're directed energy, think lasers. RF jammers is the second category. And then what we call kinetic capability. This is missiles. These are things that run into each other and with the intent to destroy. And you can use all 3 of those categories of weapons from the ground, like a missile being launched, or you can use them from space-based capabilities. And there are adversaries that are investing in all those categories of weapons.
Investing or deploying?
Both. Certainly investing across all of them. And we are seeing operational deployments of a great many of those categories of weapons today. So we used to say there are emerging threats. I don't say that anymore. There are threats on orbit. There are threats on the ground that do jeopardize our space capabilities.
It's been reported that the Russians specifically have a satellite system that acts like a nesting doll in space, and that China has launched a satellite that has a kind of a grappling arm on it that could mess with U.S. military or commercial satellites. First of all, is that true, and what can you tell me about your perspective on that?
It is true. I think it's so clever that the Russians have the nesting doll satellite.
What is that exactly?
Picture a satellite that hosts other satellites. And so you launch one satellite on orbit, and at some point in its orbital trajectory, a second satellite deploys from that initial hosting satellite, and then it can maneuver separately. You can even deploy further than that. That's why it's this nesting doll. So think about a satellite that deploys another satellite that maybe deploys something that's intended to be more like a bullet, trying to strike a satellite. So you have these nested capabilities that we would have to keep track of. That's the key piece there.
And do you see that as an offensive move that has a military mission behind it, or is it for some commercial purpose that could be peaceful?
My job is to be pretty cynical. My job is to think about worst case scenarios. My job is to make sure that we don't get caught off guard if something is used as a weapons system. So I think it's my responsibility to say, is there a weapons use for these kinds of capabilities? And I think the answer is yes, they can be used for weapons. Whether that's the initial intent, you'd have to ask the Russians. But let's talk about the grappling real quick, if you don't mind, because you brought it up, and I think this is an example of something that's fielded. Because the Chinese, could a grappling arm be used for non-weapons purposes? Absolutely. Our space shuttle had a grappling arm. But what we saw is them use the grappling arm to grab a satellite and pull it out of its operational orbit. That's an interesting use. This was in geosynchronous orbit. So could that be used for servicing satellites? Absolutely. Could that be used as a weapon? Absolutely. So now we have to think about that. But that's a deployed capability that we've seen them use on orbit.
President Trump recently signed a new executive order about space, declaring that there should be American space superiority. How did you perceive the order? How does it intersect with the Space Force's mission and what you're focused on in 2026?
It's always helpful when your boss understands the criticality of the work that you do. And I think that's the first thing I read in that, is clearly the administration, the president, understands how critical space is and how important it is that we secure the advantages that we enjoy from space capabilities. It was also a pretty sweeping executive order. You could see in there the civil aspects from a NASA perspective, manned missions to the moon, the use of R&D. It talked about commercial capabilities. Are we growing our industrial base? Are we focusing on the kinds of things from a commercial perspective that we need to for space? And then clearly he addressed there's a military need. Where we have vital national interests in space, we have to protect those interests. And that's where we get involved as a Space Force.
Space-based national security assets were also a key focus of a separate executive order that Trump signed in January 2025, calling for a next-generation U.S. missile defense shield for the entire homeland. That order specifically calls for the U.S. to be able to intercept adversarial hypersonic missiles in the so-called boost phase. Isn't that code for interceptors based in space that actually are armed? And can you tell me anything about the Space Force's role in that, where we're at with that?
Yeah, Golden Dome for America is a pretty ambitious project. So very direct. It wasn't really code. It said space-based interceptors in the executive order. So I think the guidance is clear. That's always helpful. What I would offer you at this point is, yes, that was last year, but this is an ambitious project, and it's going to take a lot of planning. It's a system of systems. We're going to have to figure out everything from what sensors are required to detect threats, how we rapidly fuse that data, how we transmit that data to the appropriate decision makers. And then you finally get to the point where you want to take action to mitigate that threat. And whether you call those interceptors or effectors, you'll hear a lot of different terminology there. But the idea is, what is it you're going to do about it? And one of the ideas was, we need to pursue whether or not space-based interceptors should be a part of this architecture. And Mike Gutlein has that task, General Gutlein has that task to sort out what technology should we bring to bear to ensure that this all fits together and that we have the ability to not only detect the threats, but then to mitigate those threats.
Do you see it as part of the Space Force's mission, whether we're talking 2026 or the next 5-10 years? Because it certainly feels like the Space Force is poised to grow quite a bit over the coming years. Is it part of the mission to protect commercial satellites in space, sort of the way the U.S. Navy plays a protector role over sea lines of communications or S-locks in oceans around the world. Is that?
I think the short answer is yes, but you got to put that in context, because all we're really saying is that the Space Force will have a role in protecting anything that's of vital national interest in terms of in, from, and through space. So to the degree that there are assets on orbit that are commercial, civil, or military, or allies and partners, quite frankly, that are vital assets to the United States for the things that we want to do, then it's my job to protect them. And we take that very seriously. And so we do that in any number of other arenas. We protect, like you mentioned, maritime assets that are commercial because they're vital to our interests. We protect ground locations because they're vital to our interests. So we're just applying that same standard to the space domain.
I want to pivot for a second. There are several U.S. companies that are launching things into space at this point.
Thank goodness. That competition, and that's vital.
And we could be talking about SpaceX, United Launch Alliance, Blue Origin. Some say the Space Force is sort of picking winners and losers in terms of which companies are given priority access to launch facilities, whether we're talking Cape Canaveral in Florida, Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. Are there enough of these launch facilities at this point? Is there a risk of creating a kind of monopolistic situation that maybe serves SpaceX over more national security focused companies that are doing national security focused launches?
Complex question there. First, are we picking winners and losers? I certainly don't see it that way. I see it, are we buying the right things to do the missions we've been asked to do, and who are the vendors that are helping provide that? What are the industry partners that are providing those capabilities? And we are always working on making sure that we buy the most effective capabilities at the best value proposition for the American taxpayer. So if that translates to winners and losers, that's your word, not mine. This is about making sure we have good industrial partners that make sure we have the capabilities we need to do our job.
Do we need more launch sites?
It's more of a question of when will we need new launch sites. Honestly, the growth of launch enterprise, just start there, has grown unbelievable since the Space Force has started. In very recent years, 9-10 launches from one of our launch bases was a full year of work. And now we're 10 times that. We did 100 in 2025, more than 100 from Cape Canaveral alone. And then, several dozen out at Vandenberg. This is 700, 800% increase in launch tempo. At some point, I don't see that ending. I don't see that tempo changing. At some point, you run out of infrastructure, you run out of capacity, and you'll have to start to explore more options. So it's more about a timing and when are we ready to invest to get the most out of that.
The Space Force sent Guardian Colonel Nick Hague to the International Space Station in 2024. Correct me if I'm wrong, though. The force right now primarily centers on ground-based command and control of space assets. When do you expect that Space Force Guardians will be put into orbit for training and or combat missions?
Yeah, we have a tight relationship with NASA. And right now, NASA has the primary responsibility in terms of human spaceflight. We contribute Guardians to that because that expertise is important to us. It's great that we have Nick back now, and he has a different perspective, quite literally, on helping us do a lot of things. Colonel Hopper before him, a tremendous background that we leverage. So we're going to continue that relationship first and foremost. Second, do we need astronauts in space, Guardian astronauts in space, to do our current missions? And right now the answer is I don't. Satellites alone are sufficient. But we're early in the days of maturing the domain with regards to national security and warfighting. As those missions change, as we progress out into regimes beyond geosynchronous orbit, out to cislunar and beyond, there may very well be a need to actually have military presence in terms of personnel on orbit. And so it's a little bit of seed corn now. We're trying to make sure we stay connected to that effort. But right now, we don't have a mission that requires it.
I want to talk to you about the challenge of OTTI, Operational Test and Training Infrastructure. Other services, the Army, the Marines, the Navy, Air Force, they all have designated training ranges. Where does the Space Force do its designated training? Where's that range, and will it be built in orbit?
Yeah, we always talk about range in several flavors. Virtual is an example where we use modeling and simulation to try to help improve our training and our testing in a digital environment. We have what's called a constructive environment too, where you pull things together in ways that they may not naturally come together, whether that's a cyber capability with a space capability, a physical capability like an airplane. You might create a constructive range where you have an airborne platform live flying, and then the space piece is virtualized, so a constructive environment. And then there's live environments, and we use on-orbit test and training capability as a part of our overall range infrastructure. So when we say operational test and training infrastructure, we mean all of those things that have to come together, because there's nothing that beats live data to draw conclusions from. So we can do modeling and sim all day. It's a lot cheaper, and we certainly want to get ahead of launch operations and make sure before we put a satellite in orbit, is it going to work? Is it going to meet our needs? So we do as much modeling and simulation as possible. But at some point, you need the live range to collect real data to see if you need to modify your models, modify your simulations, modify the tactics, modify the hardware to meet mission requirements. Do we have what we need? I'm never going to be satisfied. The missions are growing. The level of fidelity of our simulators, because technology is enhancing, we're always going to have the ability to improve the fidelity of those simulations. And I want to give our operators, our testers, our acquirers the highest fidelity simulations possible, and so that'll be an enduring effort.
The Space Force is becoming regarded as maybe the most technically advanced of the
I thought you were going to say the coolest of the services. You had a chance, you could have said that.
It is pretty cool. Okay. With tech evolving so rapidly, AI, quantum, how important is it really for military leaders in the Space Force, but also across the services, to be agile in how they learn and train as we go into this sort of high-tech future?
Yeah, you hit on it. Absolutely. I'm a dinosaur. You said seasoned experience. And so trying to teach me some of this new capabilities, I'm not the digital native that some of the young guardians are that are coming in. So the future is bright because they are already thinking along those lines. And we recognize the need to use artificial intelligence, machine learning, automation, the pace that decisions are going to need to be made when you're talking about orbital velocities definitely requires machine learning, artificial intelligence to get it right. 40,000 objects we're tracking on orbit, and those are just the ones we're tracking. How do they come together? What problems do they create? You need computer assistance in order to do that. So we're going to have to get better at it. And the other services recognize the criticality of it. They're talking about it as much as the Space Force is talking about it, which is encouraging.
General B. Chance Saltzman, so interesting, so insightful. Thank you very much for joining this edition of the Threat Status Influencers series.
Thank you, Guy. I appreciate it.
I'm Guy Taylor. Until next time.